taifa hili chini ya anga la samawati. Kuna roho inayochipuka, maadili madhubuti na halisi.
Kutoka milimani hadi kwenye tambarare, kutoka miji hadi baharini,
tunasimama kwa uhuru, kwa imani na familia. Tunaingia kwa kina katika kile tunachoamini. Maadili ya kihafidhina yameunganika rohoni mwetu. Kwa ujasiri na heshima tutasimama imara, kwa uhuru, kwa desturi, katika nchi tuliyoipata.
Welcome to another deep dive, and today we're tackling the transatlantic slave trade, but from a different angle.
Yeah.
We're going to be exploring the role of African societies in it, and trust me, it's way more complicated than most people realize.
Yeah, it's
We're going beyond that simplistic good guys and bad guys narrative, you know?
it is a very complex story with a lot of nuance.
Exactly. So get ready to uncover some really fascinating and honestly often overlooked aspects of history.
Yeah, and it's easy to sort of just picture Africa before Europeans as this, continent of isolated tribes.
Right.
But that is so far from the truth.
Okay, so paint a picture for us. What was Africa like before the Europeans showed up?
Well, you have to imagine these vast and powerful empires like Mali, or sophisticated kingdoms like Benin or Congo. These were not simple societies at all,
Right.
complex social structures, intricate trade networks,
Yeah.
and yes, even systems of servitude that predate the arrival of Europeans.
Okay, so you're saying slavery already existed in Africa?
Well, yes, but it was really different from the chattel slavery that Europeans would later impose.
Okay.
In some African societies, enslaved individuals could actually rise to positions of power. For instance, in the Songhai Empire, you see enslaved people becoming prominent military leaders or even high-ranking officials in the government.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
And this upward mobility is a stark contrast to the race-based perpetual slavery of the transatlantic trade, where, people were seen as property and nothing more.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction.
Yeah.
So it seems like these existing power structures within Africa, before Europeans arrived, must have had a significant impact on how the slave trade played out.
Oh, absolutely. And to really grasp that impact, I think we need to first understand that Africa already had these well-established trade routes,
Right.
like the trans-Saharan trade, where they were exchanging goods like gold, salt, and sometimes captives.
Okay, so then the Portuguese arrive in the 15th century looking for gold and spices, right?
Yeah, and it was a game changer.
So what happens?
Well, they stumble upon this new commodity,
Which,
human beings.
right.
And so they start establishing these coastal forts like Elmina Castle.
Yeah, I've seen pictures of those. It's just,
Yeah, they became these central hubs
yeah.
for trading enslaved Africans who would then be shipped off to work on plantations in the Americas.
It's hard to even imagine, European traders just showing up on the shores of Africa and the impact that must have had.
The demand for enslaved labor just exploded as more European powers got involved.
So it's not just the Portuguese anymore?
No, the Dutch, the English, the French, they all wanted in on this human commodity.
Wow.
And when the Dutch captured Elmina Castle in 1637, that was a major turning point in European dominance.
Right. So we have all these different European powers vying for control, but it wasn't just them, right? What about the dynamics between African societies themselves? How did this influx of Europeans change things?
One of the biggest changes was the introduction of firearms by the Europeans.
Okay.
I mean, that completely altered the balance of power between African states.
How so?
Well, those who chose to collaborate with the Europeans and got their hands on these new weapons suddenly had this huge advantage over their rivals.
So it wasn't as simple as, Europeans coming in and just forcing Africans into the slave trade.
No, not at all. It's much more nuanced than that.
Right.
This really exacerbated existing rivalries and power struggles within Africa. Yeah, some African leaders saw this as an opportunity.
Yeah.
They collaborated in the slave trade to gain wealth and power over their neighbors.
Wow. So these leaders are in this impossible situation.
Yeah, a real moral dilemma.
Right. On the one hand, they have the chance for wealth and power.
Right.
But on the other, they're participating in something that's tearing their own societies apart.
Exactly. And not every leader went along with it. Some of them vehemently opposed the slave trade.
Can you give us an example?
Yeah, King Agaja Trudeau of Dahomey.
Okay.
He actually initially tried to ban the sale of his own people. He even wrote to the Portuguese king proposing alternative forms of trade.
Wow.
But, he was facing constant attacks from a rival kingdom, and he saw an opportunity to control those coastal trade routes. So he armed his forces with European weapons, and eventually Dahomey became a very powerful slaving state.
Wow, so even a leader who starts out morally opposed to the trade ends up being pulled in by the circumstances.
Yeah, it shows those impossible choices that some leaders face.
Yeah, it also highlights that the slave trade didn't just impact, those directly involved in the buying and selling of people.
Right.
It had these ripple effects throughout African societies.
Absolutely. The very concept of who is considered an outsider, someone who could be enslaved.
Right.
That became really blurred as the demand for captives increased. People who might have once been considered part of, a larger cultural group were suddenly seen as potential commodities.
It's like this insidious system that completely warped the social fabric of African societies.
Yeah, you said it.
Turning neighbor against neighbor.
And all this is happening in Africa while Europeans are busy coming up with ways to justify their involvement.
You mean besides just wanting to make money?
Well, of course, that was a big part of it.
Right.
They argued that their economies relied on sugar, tobacco, and other cash crops. So enslaved labor was a necessity, they said.
But they also use religion to justify their actions, right?
They did, yeah.
I mean, how do you use religion to justify enslaving other human beings?
Well, they twisted the idea of Christianity, claiming that enslavement could somehow save the souls of Africans by exposing them to Christianity.
It's a really disturbing example of how religion can be manipulated.
It is.
To serve power.
Absolutely.
And it's so ironic that all of this has happened during the Enlightenment.
I know.
When these ideals of liberty and equality are supposedly taking hold in Europe.
The major blind spot, for sure.
Talk about a blind spot. But, I mean, even if they could justify it in their own minds, the reality on the ground was just brutal.
Oh, absolutely. The machinery of the slave trade was just horrific, a system designed to dehumanize people at every step. I mean, you have these raids on villages in the interior of Africa, people being torn from their families, forced to march for weeks to the coast.
It's hard to even fathom the terror those people must have felt.
And then the conditions in the coastal holding facilities were deplorable.
Right.
Disease, malnutrition, rampant.
Ugh. And then, of course, there's the Middle Passage.
The dreaded Middle Passage.
The journey across the Atlantic. I mean, it's just, I've read accounts of those ships. It's just unimaginable.
Packed like cargo chained, barely enough space to turn over.
Yeah.
The ships were overcrowded, disease was rampant. The journey itself, incredibly dangerous. So many died during the voyage, and those who survived faced unimaginable cruelty and degradation.
It's just heartbreaking.
The entire system was designed to strip them of their humanity, to reduce them to mere commodities.
And when they finally arrived in the Americas, then what?
Straight to the auction block.
Oh, God.
Families separated, individuals sold to the highest bidder, lives, futures, identities just torn apart.
It's almost too much to bear thinking about, but in the face of all of this suffering, did anyone resist?
Oh, absolutely. Despite the unimaginable horrors they faced, enslaved Africans never stopped fighting for their freedom.
That's incredible to think that even in the face of such overwhelming oppression, they never gave up hope.
It really speaks to the strength of the human spirit. In Africa, you had communities fleeing to remote areas to escape the slave raiders. Some rulers even banned the sale of their subjects, outright risking the wrath of the European powers.
Wow.
You even had brokers who would subtly sabotage deals, using their position within the system to kind of chip away at it from the inside.
So even before they were shipped across the ocean, these people were determined to fight back.
Absolutely.
That's inspiring, but what about those who were already on the ships? What were their options?
Well, there were revolts at sea.
Really?
Incredibly brave, but often unsuccessful. I mean, the conditions were horrific, but they still found ways to resist.
Wow. Do we have any accounts of those revolts?
Yeah, there's a really compelling account of a revolt aboard the ship Amistad, where the captives, led by Sangbei actually managed to overpower the crew.
Wow.
And they almost made it back to Africa before being captured off the coast of the U.S.
It's incredible that they even came close.
These weren't isolated incidents. They fought back at every opportunity.
And once they arrived in the Americas, were there any forms of resistance?
Yeah, some managed to escape and form these maroon communities.
Maroon communities, what are those?
These were self-sufficient settlements established by people who escaped slavery.
Okay.
They were often in these remote, inaccessible areas where they could live in relative freedom.
So like hidden communities.
Yeah, they would raid plantations for supplies and offer refuge to other escapees.
Wow, so these communities were like a symbol of hope for those still enslaved.
Exactly, a testament to the fact that freedom was possible.
And did these communities pose any kind of threat to the colonial powers?
As they grew and became more organized, they did.
So the resistance wasn't just about individual acts of defiance. It eventually evolved into something much bigger.
Yeah, something that really threatened the foundations of the slave system.
And this brings us to I guess, a turning point in the story, the rise of the abolitionist movement in Europe.
Yeah, finally.
I'm eager to hear more about how that movement developed.
It wasn't like a light switch, it's a gradual thing. But by the late 18th century, you start to see this convergence of factors, moral outrage, economic changes, and even just the political maneuvering among the European powers.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned economics because, the slave trade was so incredibly profitable for so long.
Right.
What prompted that shift?
Well, there were a few things going on.
Okay.
I mean, first you have the Industrial Revolution happening in Britain, right? They're shifting to more factory production.
Right.
And that makes slave labor on plantations seem less vital to their economy.
Okay.
And then second, you have the rise of what they called legitimate commerce in Africa.
Hold on. Legitimate commerce. What does that even mean?
It basically refers to trade in goods other than enslaved people.
Okay.
Products like palm oil and rubber were in high demand, and some European nations saw this as a more ethical and potentially even more profitable way to engage with Africa.
So it's not just pure altruism driving this shift.
No, of course not. There are always economic and political calculations at play.
Right. History is rarely black and white.
Exactly. It's full of shades of gray.
But regardless, I mean, it was a step in the right direction.
Oh, absolutely. And the British were really key players in this whole movement.
Okay.
Their naval patrols and the treaties they made with African leaders were aimed at suppressing the trade and had a real impact.
So the British Navy was actively trying to stop slave ships?
Yeah, they were intercepting ships freeing captives.
Wow.
They even set up a court in Sierra Leone specifically to try slave traders.
That's pretty amazing, but I mean, it's hard to imagine that the slave trade just vanished overnight.
You're right, it didn't. Despite all these efforts, clandestine slaving continued throughout the 19th century.
Really? So even after it was officially abolished, this cool trade continued?
It did. It shows you just how deeply ingrained the practice had become.
And how much money was still being made?
Exactly. The smugglers got creative. They used false flags on their ships, forged documents. They even shifted their routes further inland to avoid detection.
Wow, I can't imagine how challenging it must have been for African leaders during this time.
Oh, it was incredibly difficult.
Trying to navigate these pressures from Europe to end the slave trade while also dealing with those who were still profiting from it.
Yeah, some leaders genuinely wanted to transition to these other forms of trade.
Right.
But they faced a lot of resistance from powerful vested interests within their own societies.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, they had the constant threat of European intervention looming over them.
It sounds like an impossible situation.
It was.
And it just shows how the legacy of the slave trade continued to cast a long shadow over Africa even after it was officially abolished.
Yeah. And as the transatlantic slave trade declined, European powers were already shifting their focus to a new form of exploitation.
You mean colonialism?
Exactly. It's like the decline of the slave trade kind of paved the way for the scramble for Africa.
Right, the carving up of the continent by European powers.
It's a tragic irony, isn't it?
It is.
The end of one form of exploitation just made way for another.
Okay, so we've covered a lot here. The rise and fall of the transatlantic slave trade, the complex roles of both African and European societies, the incredible acts of resistance by enslaved people. And we've touched on those lasting impacts.
And those impacts are still felt today in Africa and in the Americas in ways that are both profound and subtle.
You keep mentioning legacies. What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, just think about the cultural impacts alone.
Okay.
The music, the food, the religious practices of African diaspora communities all around the world.
Right.
They all point to this enduring legacy of African culture, even in the face of such unimaginable hardship.
Yeah, that's a good point. Even in those darkest times, culture can endure and even thrive.
Yeah, but it's not just about celebration.
Right.
There are also some really difficult conversations that need to be had about memory and historical reckoning, especially in Africa.
What do you mean?
Well, the question of complicity is a sensitive one.
Right.
Which societies participated to what extent and what were their motivations?
It's not a simple question.
No, these are questions that continue to be debated, and there's no easy answer.
And then there's the whole issue of reparations.
Yes, that's a topic that's been gaining a lot of attention lately.
As it should.
Absolutely. The call for reparations acknowledges the immense harm that was done, and it seeks to address these lasting economic and social inequalities that stem from the slave trade.
But it's a complex issue, right?
Oh, incredibly complex. I mean, how do you even begin to quantify the damage that was done?
And who should be held accountable?
There are logistical challenges, legal debates, and of course resistance from those who don't want to be held accountable for the actions of their ancestors.
It sounds like there are no easy answers.
No, there aren't, but the fact that these conversations are even happening is a positive sign.
It is. It shows that we're finally starting to deal with the full weight of this history and to think critically about what justice might look like.
Okay, so we've talked about the cultural legacies, the historical reckoning, the call for reparations. But let's zoom in on the African perspective for a moment.
Okay.
What were some of those long-term consequences of the slave trade for the societies that participated?
Yeah.
Well, in many cases, it led to long-term economic decline. You have societies that were once thriving centers of trade and commerce,
Right.
but they became overly reliant on the export of human beings,
And that reliance.
stunted their economic development, and left them vulnerable to exploitation by European powers.
It's like a short-term gain for a long-term loss.
Exactly. They traded their own people for wealth and power, but it ultimately left them economically weakened and politically unstable.
And the effects went beyond economics, right?
Oh, absolutely. The slave trade also fueled internal conflicts and instability.
How so?
You had different groups within African societies competing for control of those lucrative trade routes and access to European goods.
So the slave trade itself was creating more conflict.
Yeah, this competition often led to violence and warfare, further destabilizing the region.
It's like a vicious cycle.
It is. It fueled conflict and instability, which in turn made those societies even more vulnerable to further exploitation.
And then what about the psychological impact?
That's hard to measure, but it's no less real.
Right.
Imagine living under this constant threat of raids and capture.
Yeah.
It created this climate of fear and distrust that permeated everyday life. It eroded the social fabric of many communities.
It's hard to imagine the trauma that inflicted on individuals, families, entire societies.
And that trauma gets passed down through generations.
It does.
And it continues to shape the way some African societies view themselves and their place in the world.
So how do we begin to address this trauma, this legacy of pain and exploitation?
Well, that's a question that individuals and nations are still grappling with. Some people believe that investing in education and economic development in the communities most affected by the slave trade is a crucial first step.
Okay.
Others emphasize the importance of cultural preservation and revitalization, helping African societies reclaim their history and their heritage.
So it's about empowering these communities to heal and to rebuild.
Exactly, both economically and culturally.
And it's also about acknowledging that the legacies of the slave trade are still shaping the world we live in today, right?
Absolutely. I mean, you see it in everything from those racial disparities in health and wealth to the ongoing struggles against racism and discrimination.
We can't just pretend it didn't happen.
We can't.
We have to confront it head on if we want to build a more just and equitable future.
And that confrontation requires both individual and collective action.
So what are some concrete steps that individuals can take to make a difference?
Well, education is key. We need to educate ourselves about this history and its ongoing impacts.
Right.
We can support organizations that are working to promote social justice and racial equality, both in Africa and in the diaspora.
And on a more personal level, I mean, we can challenge racist attitudes and behaviors whenever we encounter them.
Absolutely. It's about speaking up and using our voices to create a more just and welcoming world.
And we can use our platforms,
Yes.
social media, our workplaces, our communities.
To amplify the voices of those who are still fighting for justice and equality.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of heavy stuff today, but, I also want to highlight the resilience of African communities
Yes.
and those incredible acts of resistance that we talked about earlier.
It's so crucial to remember that this isn't just a story of victimhood.
Right.
It's also a story of strength and courage and the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome even the most horrific challenges.
There's hope to be found in those stories.
Absolutely.
It reminds us that even in the face of unimaginable darkness, there were those who fought back who refused to be broken.
Exactly. And those acts of resistance, both big and small, paved the way for the abolition of the slave trade, and they continue to inspire us today.
So even as we confront those dark legacies of the slave trade, we can also find hope in the resilience of African communities, the ongoing fight for social justice, and the possibility of creating a more equitable future for all. Yeah, it really does make you think, history is never really over.
Right.
It shapes our present in so many ways.
It really does.
And it's up to us to learn from it and work towards a better future.
I agree with that.
Speaking of uncomfortable parts of history, I keep thinking about how easily Europeans justified their role in the slave trade. I mean, we touched on the economic arguments, the religious justifications, but what else did they use to rationalize their actions?
Well, you're hitting on a key point here. It wasn't just about profit or some twisted interpretation of religion.
Right.
There was also this deeply ingrained belief in European superiority.
Oh, yeah.
Many of them genuinely believed that Africans were inherently inferior,
Like,
less civilized, less intelligent, less human.
It's sickening, really. And to think they held those beliefs while simultaneously depending on African labor to build their empires.
Yeah, it's a classic example of cognitive dissonance, right?
Totally.
They needed to dehumanize Africans to justify the exploitation.
But
at the same time, they relied on their labor and knowledge to make those colonies profitable.
it makes you wonder how they reconciled those two completely conflicting ideas in their minds.
It's a question that historians and philosophers are still trying to figure out.
Yeah.
Some argue that it was just a matter of compartmentalization,
Okay.
They separated their economic interests from their moral beliefs. Others suggest that it was more of a deliberate strategy of self-deception.
Like they just didn't want to face reality.
Exactly, a way to avoid confronting the horror of what they were doing.
So basically, they convinced themselves that it was okay to exploit and enslave Africans because they weren't fully human.
Yeah, sadly, that's pretty much it. And those ideas of racial superiority, they didn't just vanish with the abolition of slavery.
Of course not.
They lingered and morphed into new forms of prejudice and discrimination that we're still dealing with today.
It makes you realize how deeply rooted these ideas are and how much work we still have to do to dismantle them.
It's an ongoing struggle.
It is, but it's important to remember that just like the transatlantic slave trade wasn't just a story of victimhood and exploitation.
Right?
The history of African is much more than that, too.
Absolutely.
I mean, we've talked about the incredible resistance, but there's more to it than that, isn't there?
Yeah, there's a whole other layer to this story that often gets overlooked.
What do you mean?
A layer that goes beyond that traditional narrative of victimhood and focuses on the agency, the creativity, the ingenuity of African people.
Okay, I like that. So give me an example. What are we missing in that traditional narrative?
Well, take the Kingdom of Congo, for instance.
Okay.
They adopted Christianity. They sent ambassadors to Europe. They were skilled diplomats and negotiators who tried to use their relationship with the Portuguese to their advantage.
So they weren't just passively accepting what was happening.
Not at all. They were actively trying to shape the terms of engagement.
That's interesting. It really challenges that image we often have of African societies just being completely overwhelmed by European power.
Exactly. And there are countless other examples.
Like,
From the intricate art and music to the complex systems of governance and trade that they developed, African people demonstrated remarkable resilience and creativity in the face of incredible adversity.
so it's about reclaiming that narrative.
Yes.
Showing the full spectrum of the human experience.
It's about recognizing that even within a system as brutal as the transatlantic slave trade, there were moments of human connection,
Okay.
of empathy and compassion that transcended those boundaries of race and power.
You bring up a good point. Like, what about the relationships that developed between enslaved people and Europeans?
Right.
I know it's a sensitive topic, but were there instances of genuine connection, or was it always just about exploitation?
It's a nuanced conversation for sure, and often difficult.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, there were cases of exploitation where relationships were used to exert power and control, but there are also documented instances of European traders who developed genuine respect,
Okay.
even affection for the Africans they encounter. And of course, there were countless stories of love and family and friendship between enslaved people themselves.
Right.
Relationships that provided solace and strength in the face of unimaginable hardship.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. It's a reminder that even in the most dehumanizing systems, human connection is still possible.
Absolutely, and those stories, often overlooked or dismissed, offer a different perspective on this complex history.
Right.
They remind us that the transatlantic slave trade wasn't just about these abstract forces like economics or politics, but about real people, individuals with their own stories, hopes, and dreams.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with this mix of emotions, sadness, anger, but also a sense of awe at the strength and resilience of those who endured this horrific chapter in history.
It's a lot to process, for sure, and it's a history that demands our attention, our reflection, and our commitment to creating a world where such atrocities are never repeated.
Well said. This has been a truly eye-opening conversation for me.
Yeah.
I feel like I've gained a much deeper understanding of the transatlantic slave trade and its lasting impacts.
I'm glad to hear that. It's been my pleasure to share this journey with you.
Yeah, thank you. And remember, this is just the beginning.
Right.
There's always more to learn, more to explore.
Keep asking questions.
Keep damaging assumptions.
Keep striving for a more just and equitable world.
Well said. And to our listener, we hope this deep dive has inspired you to continue exploring this complex and crucial topic.
Until next time, keep diving deep.
And keep seeking truth wherever it may lead.
Katika moyo wa taifa hili chini ya anga la samawati. Kuna roho inayochipuka, maadili madhubuti na halisi. Kutoka milimani hadi kwenye tambarare, kutoka miji hadi baharini, tunasimama kwa uhuru, kwa imani na familia. Tunaingia kwa kina katika kile tunachoamini, maadili ya kihafidhina yameunganika roho